Deputy Rice, do we have all 14 minutes? And we have all the jurors. When you're ready, line them up, bring them in. Yeah, the two must have got the message. Because we got them all now.
Yeah, who showed up? Never mind, doesn't matter.
Folks, if you haven't already, check your cell phones, electronic devices, make sure they're off, put away. Good afternoon, yes it is.
Or afternoon. Pick in the morning.
Usual questions, folks, on your cell phone, right? And those are your notepads?
Yes, I believe.
All right, there's in the jury box, Nancy, if you want.
My usual question, good afternoon. Has anybody received any information outside of court?
No.
And I know you all got the message except one, I guess, about the late start. I have no idea who that is, but I'm glad that, now I do. Well, I'm glad most people got it, and hopefully you had something you could do that was pleasant during that time. Okay. Defense, you may call your first witness.
Just approach.
Yes. phone?
Staple arrest.
Thank you. You may call your first rebuttal witness.
Judge of defense calls Heather Davis.
All the way over here, man. And if you would, stand right here. Face this close, raise your right hand, and prepare to take the oath.
You do solemnly swear affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
And now, ma'am, if you would, step over here, have a seat in the red chair. Speak in a loud and clear voice for the court. Make sure you go up close to the mic. And here's a little couple more for you already.
Thank you. Hello.
Ms. Davis, can you, I guess, remind the jury what your name is?
My name is Heather Davis.
And how are you employed?
I'm the Counseling and Social Service Supervisor at North Florida Evaluation and Treatment Center.
All right, so that includes not only your employment, but your occupation?
Yes.
Okay. Am I paying you to be here today?
No.
Did you see Mr. Jonchuck upon his arrival at your facility?
I did the first time. The second time I happened to be out that day.
Okay, so the first day he showed up, you saw him.
Yes, sir.
Was he actively psychotic?
Yes, sir.
Can we approach?
The purpose of him being sent to your hospital was for the hospital to restore him to competence, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Was it easy to do that?
No, sir.
How long did it take the first time?
The first time it took a year,
And how long did it take the second time?
7 months.
And how many medications or how many medicines did it take?
It took approximately 10 medications to make him competent the first time.
Did there need to be adjustments made to that medication?
Medications were added, medications were taken away, and the dosages were changed by the doctor.
Yes.
Good, so I could have a moment.
Sure.
Ms. Davis, did John have a hallucination at the hospital?
Yes.
And how long did that last?
Well, the actual hallucination lasted 1 to 2 days, but after that, we started characterizing it as a delusion because he wasn't seeing the dinosaurs anymore. He was just talking about how they were present out in the parking lot. So we changed the characterization from a hallucination to a delusion.
And how long did that delusion last?
Approximately 2 weeks.
Is he embarrassed by that?
Yes, he is.
You were part of John's treatment team
Yes, from the beginning.
the whole time.
Yes.
Okay. Did you talk to him about the upcoming evaluations by the experts?
That's one of my responsibilities, is to schedule legal visits, and yes, I did notify him about them.
Was he stressed out by them?
Yes,
By just one expert's visits or by all the experts?
all the experts.
I'm going to object to relevance.
And that means both sides?
Yes,
Experts
sir.
from both sides? Did the hospital ever diagnose John with antisocial personality disorder?
Objection, that's already been asked and answered.
They would, not specific.
Whoa, go ahead. Overruled.
Did the hospital ever diagnose John with antisocial personality disorder or borderline personality disorder?
No,
Is the hospital, the facility that you work in, are the grounds, the rooms, is the whole place wired for audio?
Audio and video. There's a couple private areas, restrooms, and the rooms where they sleep are their private areas.
Does that operate 24 hours a day?
24/7, 365.
So all the time?
Yes.
Do you use that video, audio to look for malingering?
We use the video and audio for many things, and one of them is to review incidents and behaviors to look for evidence of malingering.
And does the hospital look for malingering?
Yes.
Why?
Because our goal is not to keep people at the facility if they do not need our treatment. Our ultimate goal with people who are considered incompetent to proceed is to get them back to the court to address their charges.
So if someone is malingering, are they sent back?
Yes.
Did the hospital ever diagnose him with malingering?
No.
As part of your duties at the hospital, do you bring John to the evaluations and to the meetings with the doctors and the lawyers?
Yes.
Did you bring him to meetings with the defense lawyers here?
Yes.
Did those defense lawyers ever wheel in large boxes of police reports or discovery or exhibits?
No.
How often do you see John?
I see him 2 to 3 times per week, and initially when he first got there the first time, I saw him a lot more than that.
I'm going to object, I just go to rebuttal, so I've been using that for original testimony.
Have you talked to John?
Not today, but I have talked with him while he was at my facility.
So you have talked to him over the course of the 4 years he's been there?
Yes.
Have you observed him talk to other people during the course of the 4 years he's been there?
Yes.
Does John pause between someone asking him a question and him answering?
Yes.
Does he do that to you?
Yes.
Have you seen him do that to other people?
Yes.
Does he only do it when a doctor asks him a question?
No.
Do you know why he does that?
Well, medication sometimes slows people down, slows their thought processes down, and then I've talked to him about it specifically when he gets stressed. It's hard for him to get his thoughts together to respond.
Are you aware of the term empathy?
Yes.
Does John show?
Objection. Approach.
Does John show empathy?
Yes, he does.
How?
I've seen him show empathy toward his peers at the facility. There's people who are not as high functioning as him, so he's shown empathy toward them. If one of his friends didn't get a visit that they were anticipating, I've seen him show empathy then.
Judge, if I could have a moment.
Sure.
Ms. Davis, I asked you a question, whether John was stressed by the upcoming evaluations by the experts. Did he tell you why he was stressed by that?
That's hearsay.
Sustain.
Following up on something I asked you about the procedure to do the evaluations, did you bring John to his first evaluation with Dr. Lazaro?
I called for him and then brought him up there, yes.
Did you hear Dr. Lazaro say that she did not even need to do the evaluation?
That's
Overruled.
leading.
Overruled.
Did-
I'll have to ask her what she heard, Dr. Lazaro. You're right, sustain. Go ahead.
All right. Did you hear what Dr. Lazaro said prior to that evaluation?
Yes, I did.
What was it?
I heard her say that she didn't need to evaluate him to know he didn't have a mental illness.
That's all I have, Judge.
Ross?
Afternoon, Dave.
Hello.
So, when that statement was made, where was Dr. Lazaro?
So we were in the visitation area, and there was the elevators here. There was a table here, and she was between the elevator and the table, as was I.
Okay. And you would agree that counsel for state defense was also there as well, correct?
Yes.
All right. And so when you are alleging that she made this statement, you're alleging that she made it with everybody present, right?
Yes.
Okay. But you're the only one who heard the statement, correct?
Well, I don't know what you heard.
Right. You didn't hear us respond to any statement, though, correct?
I did not hear you respond, but it was my interpretation that she was talking with you.
Okay. But you don't know what I heard, or what Mr. Ellis heard, or what Mr. Williams heard, correct?
Correct.
Right. And when you say that she made that statement, you would agree that you also allege that she said that she needed more information later on while she was there at the state hospital, correct? That she wanted to talk to his mother, that she wanted to talk to his uncles and some other people, right?
I heard her say that something about an interview with the mother and the uncles.
Right. So you're saying that she made that statement, that she knew he had a mental illness, but also you're saying that she was wanting to get more information as well from other people, correct?
She made the statement that she knew he didn't have a mental illness. You said it wrong.
Okay, I'm sorry if I said it
Okay.
wrong.
And I don't know if she was implying that she had already met with the mother and the uncles, or if she was going to. I just heard mother and uncle and interview.
Okay.
So once I heard the first statement, I'll admit that I was kind of shocked and had a moment in my brain where I was thinking, ooh. And then when I came back, that's what I heard.
But you would agree, it would make a lot of sense to make that statement and then turn around and say that she still had to get more evidence from other sources, correct?
Yes, but that's not what I heard. I heard the word interview. I heard the word uncle, mother, so I don't know if they were past or future interviews.
Okay.
Okay?
And you would agree that when we were all there, we were setting up video cameras, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And you said that there's cameras present throughout the building, correct?
Right.
All right. But to your knowledge, that was never captured on any type of video, correct?
Well, because when attorneys are present, they want the cameras turned off. So that's, you're supposed to be having privacy. So we don't interfere with that.
Okay. Have more, Your Honor? Go ahead.
Anything further?
No, Your Honor.
Can this witness be excused?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you for making the trip twice.
Thank you.
Oh, question, sorry. Can you, Ms. Davis, sit down again, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, and does anybody have any questions? No, okay.
I'm Ms. Davis.
Feel free to leave, thank you.
Okay. Have a good day.
You may call your next witness.
The defense calls Dr. Mayer.
So if you would, stand right here for me, please. Put your right hand, prayer, pick the oath.
You do solemnly swear affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, I do. And sir, we're going to have a seat in the red chair. Thank you. Loud and clear voice for the court, make sure you move close to the mic.
Could you please reintroduce yourself to the jury?
Yes, Michael Scott Mayer, Maher, MD.
Dr. Mayer, I would like to talk a little bit about when you're doing a differential diagnosis and ruling in or out a mood disorder, okay? Like bipolar.
Okay.
What, if anything, does a history of stimulant use, like Adderall, have on making that rule in or rule out decision?
Bipolar disorder is a mood disorder. It's also a disorder which overlaps a bit with other conditions that are sometimes diagnosed earlier in life. So in any mood disorder, I would take a history. I would listen to the person's history. I would ask them and possibly family members questions about their background and history, going back to birth history. In that regard, one of the things that is a tip-off that an adult might be, and I presume this question is related to an adult, might be related to mood disorder, is a history of attention deficit disorder. So there's a correlation, a connection between attention deficit disorder. The first thing is that sometimes you'll or symptoms their previous reaction to those types of stimulant medications.
Go ahead.
The second important part of that is to establish whether they have a history of taking other drugs which may have had an effect on their mood disorder. Some drugs such as Prozac, one of the long-standing, historically known antidepressant drugs, is a drug that can, at times, produce a stimulant-like effect in adults. So understanding how people have responded to previous drugs is an important part of thinking about and choosing the medication options for a present diagnosis of bipolar disorder.
Would it be proper to rule out an adult diagnosis of bipolar disorder based on the fact that someone had been prescribed a stimulant like Adderall in the past?
No, there's nothing in the fact that the stimulant has been previously used that would rule in or rule out the diagnosis of bipolar disorder or any other mood disorder. There just isn't that kind of correlation present.
Are you familiar with recent literature on this topic?
I am. I keep up with the literature, I read the literature, I keep up with the FDA reports on Adderall use and the side effects it produces and the beneficial effects that it produces. There's nothing in that literature or the FDA reports that suggests that a specific response to Adderall tells us what the diagnosis is or is not.
What is is there a primary medical specialization board?
Yes, the American Board of Medical Specialties. It's the board that I have my board certification in psychiatry and forensic psychiatry.
Is that the sort of largest or the organization that most medical doctors get certified through?
It is the only organization that certifies medical schools in the United States. It is the only organization that is universally recognized in the United States as a medical certification board. In the first instance, that is establishing medical certification for people in a specialty. So if you go to a doctor and they say they're a specialist and they're board certified, the certificate on the wall should say certified by the American Board of Medical Specialties.
Do you have to do retesting to maintain your forensic certification?
Yes.
As well as other requirements like continuing education?
Many requirements in addition to testing.
I'd like to move into talking about psychosis. An area that we didn't previously talk about was whether there can be different levels of organization to a delusion. Is that something you could explain?
Yes.
And would you?
Yes. So I've talked a good deal about delusions, and I'm sure the jury has heard a lot about it. Not to go over things too much, this is a false belief which is disconnected with common sense reality. There are times that people have delusions, and I'll start with one extreme, that are very, in their own heads, that are very clear, that are very definite, that are in some respects very well organized. Sometimes in medical terms, we call those delusions internally consistent. If you accept that one part of the delusion is true, then pretty much everything else makes a certain amount of sense. So an example of that would be a person believes that the CIA is targeting them for purposes of exploitation and experimentation, and they have put an implant in their brain. If a person absolutely believes that, then it also makes sense that they would believe that their headaches are caused by that implant. They would believe that a mistake they make on their checking account is caused by the implant causing that mistake to occur. That they would believe that they're not treated right by police officers because the police officers know that the CIA has control over them. So that's an organized delusion based on a false belief with a certain amount of internal consistency. In the extreme of those cases, we have a separate diagnostic category called delusional disorder that we would put those people in. So that's on one end of the organizational spectrum of delusions, on the very organized end. Sometimes those are referred to as fixed delusions in common language, not in medical or formal diagnostic language. In formal or medical diagnostic language, we call that a delusional disorder, and it's included in the diagnostic manual and so on. On the other end of the spectrum, we have very disorganized delusions, false beliefs about what's happening in a person's environment that change truly from minute to minute and hour to hour, and change not just in what the person is thinking about or focusing on, but whether the delusion is a positive thing or a negative thing. So for example, people sometimes develop what are called grandiose delusions. Grandiose delusions are the idea that I've just won the lottery and I have $100 million in the bank, and I'm going to go down to the airport and I'm going to give them my credit card and I'm going to get on a plane and I'm going to go to Las Vegas and I'm going to start doing things with my $100 million. And they get to the airport and then they start thinking, well, this isn't quite right, I'm not going to do this, but I have superpowers. So I'm going to go back home and I'm going to swim across Tampa Bay. And then they get down to the water and that doesn't seem like a good idea anymore, and they develop some other idea about their grandiose or superpower connection to reality, and it changes moment to moment. Even that is a somewhat organized delusion because it's all around this idea that the person has special qualities, special powers, and so on. Other delusions that are at the far end of disorganized are hard even for me as a psychiatrist to really put into organized logical language. But if I see such a person in my office, it's clear that they have beliefs that are disconnected with reality. They change from time to time, and it's very hard to challenge them about those beliefs, to say, you know, this really doesn't make sense, and let's try to be a little more logical here. So delusions run the gamut from very disorganized to very rigid and, if you will, organized.
Would believing oneself to be the Pope and then God and then fallen angel Michael, having that move from entity to entity or thing to thing, does that mean that it's not a delusion?
No, actually that would be an example of a somewhat consistent, grandiose element in a delusion. So thinking yet you're the Pope means you're thinking you're bigger and more important than you really are. It's grandiose. Thinking that you're God, likewise. Thinking that you're the fallen angel Michael is also a grandiose delusion with another piece to it, which is that it's shifting from you're all-powerful to you are impotent. You have fallen. You have lost all your power. And that's consistent with a delusion which is losing some of its organizational cohesiveness, because it's going from grandiose to being completely powerless.
And do you see people in your practice that have that disorganized kind of delusional state?
Yes. It's part of the challenge of treating people with severe mental illness, to help people with those disorganized features get a little bit more organized without being stuck on something that is disabling to them.
If a person suffers from a more disorganized type of delusion, let's say about God, the Pope, up in that same line, if they hear something about the delusional subject, let's say the person hears, somebody says, "Are you God?" Is that going to make the person automatically fall into a delusional state that they cannot be pulled out of?
No.
Why not?
People have different responses to their... So that would be an example of a delusion being challenged. And people have all kinds of different reactions to a delusion being challenged. If I were to encounter a person on the street who is ranting and raving and physically agitated and screaming that they're God and the world is going to come to an end, I certainly would not challenge that person, because a challenge to that person is likely to result in an aggressive, possibly violent reaction. On the other hand, if a person comes to my office and I am treating them for a delusional disorder, even if it is not long-standing treatment, and they talk to me about this belief that somehow somebody is poisoning them, somebody has it in for them, somebody is treating them in a systematic, organized, negative way that's going to hurt them, it is essential that in some respect, either more assertively or less assertively, that I challenge that person. I say, well, let's look at this in some detail. This doesn't really make a lot of sense. So let's you and me look at it together and see how we can better understand it. And people respond differently to that. Some people respond by withdrawing. Some people with a delusion under that circumstance will withdraw. It's as if they're saying, well, if you don't believe me, I don't think I want to talk to you anymore. Other people respond by saying, well, you don't believe me, but it's really true. That is, they sort of come back at you, not aggressively or violently, but come back at you. Other people, sometimes, under the right circumstances, sometimes with the benefit of medication, can say, well, I'm not really sure if it's happening all the time, but sometimes it seems so real. I mean, these are words I've heard from patients. And that's obviously a therapeutic opening. Then there's an opportunity to help the person use their logical mind that is still healthy to challenge their own confused and delusional thinking. So these are some of the things that happen when a delusion is challenged.
Okay, so in your practice, have you gone through this process of trying to therapeutically challenge a delusion?
Many, many times.
And when you do that, does a person automatically fall into the delusion such that you cannot bring them out of it and have a conversation about it?
No.
Just a question previously was asked and answered.
No, by no means does that always happen.
For a person who suffers from a psychotic disorder, is there necessarily an obvious first-time presentation of the symptoms?
There usually is not. So if we professionals look at people who suffer from psychotic disorders, one of the patterns is, and this often comes to the doctor, to me in my practice, through family members rather than the patient. We thought everything was okay. He wasn't doing that good. He had some trouble in school, but then all of a sudden, and then they'll tell you the story about the psychotic episode. So from the point of observation of a family member, sometimes psychotic illness presents suddenly. Very often in those cases, after treatment has begun, it becomes obvious that that person has been struggling with auditory hallucinations or other symptoms of psychosis for weeks or months leading up to this dramatic, obvious psychotic break or intense psychotic episode that is noticed by everybody. Now, there are also many cases where the obvious dramatic psychotic break is not the first thing that's noticed. That the first thing that's noticed is the person is withdrawn, the person is depressed, depression and psychosis go together, the person is confused about things. Family members will sometimes bring somebody into treatment saying, well, you know, he's always had kind of different ideas about things, but it's really gotten strange lately and we're really concerned about him. So that's another way that a psychotic illness might present to treatment facilities. It is my experience that a very dramatic, immediate psychotic break is usually not the way psychotic illness first presents. And I believe my education and modern research and recent research in the last 3 to 5 years supports that conclusion.
Could what John experienced in December and into January when Phoebe died, could that have been his first real obvious psychotic break?
Yeah, to previously talked about the witness, not the subject for rebuttal.
It certainly could have been. It could have been the most intense and, if you will, undeniable psychotic break. What's obvious to one family, to one social network, to one treatment team is not necessarily obvious to another. There are some pretty good indications in the medical record of Dr. Arthur that he recognized psychotic symptoms. I would, in fact, say he did recognize psychotic symptoms. Now, that doesn't mean that the psychotic symptoms that he was recognizing would be ones that a non-medical person would recognize.
I'll sustain the prior objection, if that's what it is, for this part.
Okay. If this December, January, intense and undeniable episode that John experienced, if it was the first one that was of that nature, does that mean he could not have been insane when Phoebe died?
No.
Moving on, is a personality disorder a primary diagnosis or a secondary diagnosis?
It is a secondary diagnosis.
And what does that mean?
It means that it comes after consideration of other more important primary considerations. So this is a circumstance that exists in many areas of medicine and in psychiatry in particular. So if a person has a brain tumor, that's the primary diagnosis. If they have depression because of the brain tumor, that's a secondary diagnosis. It's related to the first diagnosis, and it's being caused by the first diagnosis, but it's also a diagnosis which is important to recognize and treat and consider. So personality disorder, not exactly the same as brain tumor and depression, but similar in the respect that I just explained, is a secondary diagnosis.
Are you familiar with psychopathy and the PCLR checklist?
I am.
Do you know how to use the checklist?
I am trained and familiar and authorized by the copyright holders to use the instrument, as it's called, the checklist, and I have familiarity with it.
Is the PCLR relevant to this case?
I don't believe it adds anything substantive to an understanding of this case.
I want to move on and talk about John's medications. You've reviewed the Pinellas County Jail records.
I have.
Did you note that John weighed 225 pounds when he was booked into jail?
Yes.
We've heard testimony about the doses of medications that John was on in the first year he was at the state hospital versus the doses that he is on and has been on for the last couple of years. Can you explain why the doses have changed?
In broad terms, yes. In detailed terms with regard to each specific medication, that would go beyond what I know. But in broad terms, yes. When a person is first treated, when a person is hospitalized, especially in an intensive environment, especially where there are very serious issues at hand, such as there are in this case, great care to do no harm and to also avoid confusing the situation, muddying the picture by being overly aggressive with medication is one of the goals and requirements of the treatment team. So when a person is first hospitalized, sometimes, not always, sometimes the treating physicians will not give them any medication so they can observe them medication-free. Sometimes that's not practical. Sometimes they've already been started on medication, so there's already medication in their system. Occasionally, medications will be withdrawn, even if the treating doctor thinks they might be needed, because they want to be sure. They don't want to be presumptive about the medication need. When medications are started, they are started at the lowest likely therapeutic dose. The smallest number of medications in the lowest dose, in the lowest likely therapeutic dose. Giving 10% of the therapeutic dose doesn't make any sense, because the therapeutic dose is the dose that we would expect a person to have some positive response to. On the other hand, sometimes giving half of the therapeutic dose might be a reasonable thing to do, to be very cautious. The therapeutic dose is a low dose. As it is possible to evaluate the person's response to the initial dose, the initial low therapeutic dose, it is likely that that dose will be raised. Some medications, it's possible to assess the person's response to the medication in days or weeks. Some medications, it takes months, possibly many months, 6 months, to assess their response to the medication. So some medications that are started at a low dose might be raised rather quickly if we have good indication that that medication has a rapid effect on the target symptoms. Some medications might be raised very slowly so that we don't overdose or over-medicate a person before we've really had a chance to see, are they responding to the medication. So the pattern of hospitalized patients is usually that they begin the hospitalization with lower doses, and gradually those doses are raised a bit. At some point, some might be lowered, some might be raised. There are adjustments in the medication. But the pattern is that the medications are raised to the effective dose, and that effective dose is usually a bit higher than the minimal therapeutic dose.
You described John's illness, his brain illness, as progressive when you were here last week. How does the increase in the dosages of his medications relate to the progressiveness of his illness?
So his illness was present and impairing his ability, certainly during his years of treatment in 2013 with Dr. Arthur. And over a period of time, it waxed and waned a little bit, but gradually it got worse. And it has continued to worsen since he was arrested and been in the state hospital. And as the brain illness, the brain deterioration gets worse, certain medications are likely to require higher levels. Some medications might actually benefit from lower levels, but in the same way that treatment of other brain diseases like Parkinson's disease require higher doses as the disease progresses, his mood disorder and psychotic disorder is likely to require higher doses as the disease progresses.
Are you familiar with Dr. Arthur's records that in September of 2013, John had an abnormal
Objection,
EEG.
Evie.
Sustained.
Did John have an abnormal EEG in September of 2013?
Yes, he did.
And where is that information contained?
It's contained in Dr. Arthur's records.
And what is an abnormal EEG?
So an EEG is an electroencephalogram. It's the test that's done with sticky electrodes on the person's head. Sometimes they're put on with a cap, sometimes they're put on individually. It's a recording of electrical discharges that can be identified through the scalp that originate in the brain. Multiple channels or electrodes are placed. It produces a lot of data, a lot of information, and it can be read and understood in very detailed terms or in broad terms. The broad term reading of an electroencephalogram gives us patterns and rhythms that are known to be consistent with normal brain functioning. On the other hand, individuals with seizure disorders have very specific kinds of abnormal EEG output, electroencephalogram output, which is recorded by the test and is associated with the abnormal electrical activity which forms the basis of seizure disorder in the brain. So an abnormal EEG is an indication of abnormal electrical is a direct measurement of abnormal electrical activity of the brain and is an indication of seizure disorder.
And specifically with the strobe light, what is the abnormal with a strobe light mean?
So one of the techniques that's used for EEGs, since seizure disorders are intermittent, since people who have seizure disorders generally, hopefully, are not having seizure disorders many times a day, since often they only have seizure disorders a few times a month. An EEG is a one-time recording. You can't put it on a person and leave it there for days at a time. So one of the techniques that has been used to make electroencephalograms more capable of identifying abnormal electrical activity in the brain is to stimulate the person with something that might stimulate that abnormal electrical activity. So you put a stimulus present which a normal brain is not going to respond to in an abnormal way, but an abnormal brain will reveal itself because of that stimulus. So a strobe light, a flashing bright light, creates a visual pattern in the brain which the EEG can pick up, and it picks that up and measures it. What it measures can be normal or abnormal. If it's abnormal, that's an indication of an underlying seizure disorder. So an abnormal EEG, which is based on strobe light stimulation, means that without that strobe light, the EEG is not abnormal. With that strobe light, the EEG is abnormal, and it's consistent with an individual who has a seizure disorder which is not always present, but is episodically present, which is most seizure disorders.
May I have one moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
Malingering. Is that relevant to your opinions regarding John?
Yes.
What is your opinion about that with regards to John?
In any forensic evaluation, even in clinical evaluations, it's important to know if a person is being honest, if the person is being credible, even if they're trying to be honest, are they giving you the information that's actually accurate? Do they have a specific reason to give you false information to try to lead you to a false conclusion? That is basically what malingering is in a medical context. The person is giving you specific information to lead you to specific wrong conclusions. So one of the things I do in my office is evaluations for disability. And during those evaluations, it's very important that I consider the possibility that maybe the person is giving me false information to lead me to think that they are disabled so that they can collect benefits. And in fact, that might not be the case. That would be a straightforward example of malingering. There are various ways of identifying malingering. The very best way of identifying malingering is to have a 24-hour-a-day long-term observation period of the person. So if I could be a video camera on the top of this person's head, who I'm evaluating for disability, and be with them 24 hours a day for a month, it's a pretty good chance I'd have an idea of what they can do and what they can't do and what's real and what isn't real. Another way of doing that is to have somebody in a hospital. Somebody who's in a hospital who has 24-hour observation staff, who's there for a long time, months, weeks, years. That's the best way to evaluate whether their symptoms are real and genuine or not. And in this case, I see no indication from the record whatsoever that the hospital staff believed that malingering was a significant part of this picture with regard to John.
Might a person be able to malinger, fake it for a week or a month or a couple months?
Yes.
Can they do it for 4 years?
In my experience, that would be absolutely unheard of.
Thank you.
Cross?
Any questions? All right. All rise. Court being recessed till 2:55 according to the courtroom clock.